Apple, when they first introduced the iPhone, they needed a chip that would be very power efficient and fast. The ARM-based processors, and then eventually they had their own. The A4 first came out, it's their own chip. And they
Mhm.
invested and they did that. And then I think what you saw is that got better. They got better at designing their own chips, and they saw from Apple's perspective, what can we do when we make our own silicon? Look what we can do with these phones. Look what we can do with these iPads. And I think actually there was a period in the 20 teens where
Mhm.
Apple thought, and I mean, they even had an ad, an iPad is a computer, right?
Right.
And I think there was a brief time during the mid-teens that Apple thought the iPad and the iPhone were going to be the future.
Welcome to our fourth Tosh Talks episode, Apple at 50, talking to Neal Pann of Apple for Architects. Neal's one of the three co-founders of the now defunct but incredibly popular ArchiSpeak podcast, and the creator of Apple for Architects, a website and podcast series he ran for years devoted entirely to all things Apple and the practice of architecture on the Mac. He is also the owner of one of the largest personal collections of Macs I have ever seen or heard about, which we will see in a moment. And the perfect person to talk to and feature on Architosh, given Apple's 50th anniversary year. We start with Neal's recollections, origin stories, and early passion for all things Apple, and end the talk diving deep on the psychology of the Mac user, the multiple ironies of Apple's own architecture, the ill-fated ARM-based Newton, and how Apple Silicon today is ideal for the world of CAD and BIM. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to bring you my conversation with architect Neal Pann from Apple for Architects. Neal Pann, thanks for joining us on Tosh Talks. It's great to talk to you. We've spoken to each other so many times over the years, and I've been on your podcast. You've obviously are one of the founders of ArchiSpeak, and I wasn't on ArchiSpeak, but I used to listen to it from time to time. And you're a very interesting guy in my world because there's not many other people I know who are as passionate or more passionate about the Macintosh in the architecture space. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, as you mentioned, we've known each other for a long years. I've been a huge fan of yours for, gosh, almost maybe 25 years now. I remember first finding Architosh online and just thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Somebody's actually talking about architecture and using the Macintosh because in my career that I've been practicing, when I first started, to not quite to date myself too much, but I mean, we were hand drafting and slowly we started introducing computers into the office that I worked in at the time. And we were using something called DataCAD, but was a competitor to AutoCAD in the 80s. But as the 90s rolled in and through, AutoCAD took over and became the de facto standard.
Wow.
But all of that just pretty much ran on the PC. And so
Wow.
for pretty much my entire career, other than the times I was practicing for myself, for a number of years, but everything I've ever done professionally as an architect has always been on one Windows, originally DOS and Windows PCs. So to find your site was just like a breath of fresh air. Hey, somebody's paying attention to this.
Mhm.
And not only you, but Apple at the time in the early 2000s was also, I think they even had a page on their site that was, Apple and architecture or the Macintosh and architecture. I can't remember the exact title, but it
Yeah.
existed and they kind of pushed that. And it was very exciting to see. As much as I wanted to, practice with a Mac. I mean, I had always used one at home,
Mhm.
because a little bit of my story is I actually used a Mac in an architectural office when I first started. So Yeah, so I
So
first
we had a
started.
brief moment. We had a brief moment where you were on the Mac.
I suppose so, but we
Macintosh.
weren't really drafting on it because, this was very early days. Um, this was back in a time when we had basically the 128K Mac, a Macintosh Plus
Mhm.
era. And the architect I first started working for right after high school, he had a 128K Mac. And then that summer, um, a coworker started there and he had a Mac 512. In fact, on the screen here, that Mac right there is
Mhm.
that very same Mac from that summer.
Oh, wow. That's
He ended
amazing.
up giving it to me some years later, so that's why it sits on the column there. It's a
That
very
is so
special
cool.
Mac to me because that one there ended up being the very first Mac I've ever used.
But since this is about the 50th anniversary
Yeah.
of Apple, and for us, it's really a conversation about the Mac, let's dig into your other third really interesting thing to t discuss, which is your personal little collection of Macs. So how did that come about? And like, was it an accident? You just kept your old Macs likely like I have done, and you didn't want to part with them. And then next thing you know, you have more and more, and you just like, I'm going to start a little collection. Is that how it worked?
Very close. Yes,
Right.
actually. I did have a number of Macs that I had just used for so long that it wasn't worth selling them. Some I did, right? I mean, there's definitely some because back at the day, it was like in order to buy your next Mac, you had to
Mhm.
sell the previous one. And if you
Right.
did it on a 2 to 3 year period of time, you could get, enough money to pay for a third or something like that. And if you
Sure.
were lucky, a half of your new machine or something. And so that's what I did. But I always kept like everything. I kept the boxes, the paper, everything. So usually I got pretty good resale value on some of this stuff. And then eventually, I think, I wasn't moving all the time. I wasn't going from apartment to apartment. I had a house. I bought a
Mhm.
house, and so I had place, space then. Um, and I didn't, and going through the profession made a little bit more. I could afford to keep some of this stuff and
Mhm.
didn't need to necessarily sell the previous one to get the next one. So
Mhm.
you ended up with, I ended up with a few. And then I think over time, they just start collecting. And I was giving some thought to this, like, well, why this collection? Why a number of these things? And I think it goes back to those very early days of first using a Mac and really appreciating the computer for what it allowed me to do.
Mhm.
And it was made it so easy to do. Although, honestly, if we're being honest, System 6 or before System 6, System 7, it crashed a lot. There were a lot of, it wasn't always as easy and simple as these operating, Mac OS 10 is today.
Right.
Um, or as stable, I should say. But there, I appreciated not only the operating system and how simple it was, but the design of the computers themselves.
Mhm.
They were pieces of art. This Mac, original Mac behind me, and the Mac Pluses and the SEs, and the Mac 2s back in the day. These were really beautiful pieces of art.
Mhm.
In fact, I have a book. It's over here on the shelf called Apple Design, which I
Right.
believe now is out of print. But it's just a gorgeous book that goes through a lot of their design from the time. And so I had a real appreciation for their design. But at the time, I was, either a college student. You couldn't buy any of these things. If you were lucky, you bought one, and that became your computer you used for 5 years or something. And
Right.
so for me, eventually, I had space. I had maybe some disposable income at that point, at least enough to find some of these things on the secondary market that were 15 to 20 years old at that point. So you can pick something up for $50, $100. And so it's not a huge investment. And it was just kind of a way for me to kind of relive a little bit of
Right.
nostalgia of an era of I really lusted after this one computer, and I couldn't buy it because it was, I don't know, $3,000, $4,000 in 1990 money, and now I can get
Yes.
it for $100, right? So, um, and yeah, so it just became kind of like, oh, I have to build, I got to get some shelves. Oh, I got extra space now. And what else can I find? And so a lot of my collection is kind of relatively common things you can pick up.
Hmm.
Some of these iMacs are relatively common, you can get. There's definitely some things like the Mac Cube that I have over here behind me.
Hmm.
Those are a little more, or that Blue Dalmatian iMac. Those are a little more rare. It takes a little more hunting to find and,
Hmm.
and a little more costly.
Yes.
Um, so I think that's kind of how it started. You just kind
Right.
of get obsessed. And I even created an entire list of, former Apple products, and I just kind of
Right.
check them off as I go to find. And so, like I mentioned, a big chunk of things that I have are all relatively easy to get. There's definitely things out there that are much harder to find and are way more expensive.
Hmm.
Um, one of the ones I have is a 20th anniversary Macintosh. It's actually still in the box. It has been out. It does work. I have
Right.
used it briefly a couple of times just to play around with it. But it's all original. It's got some of the manuals are still shrink wrapped. The pens and pencil sets are still in there.
Wow.
It's really kind of a machine that I know a little bit of the history of it. It was really never used. It was
Yeah.
purchased, somebody had it and boxed it, and you open up the boxes because in the main box, there's four or five different other boxes of all the
Mhm.
different components because it's got the base and the space speaker system, the keyboard, and the computer itself, the monitor, and everything. And so when you open some of these up, and it still smells like a new computer.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
That's
So,
awesome.
it just kind of grew over time, and occasionally you got lucky, and like that 20th anniversary Mac, I picked that up like 16 years ago now, 17 years ago. So I've just kind of held on to it. But
Is that the one that's in Batman, the film?
oh, now you're
It it it,
it
it
might be.
it's black and it has
Yes.
it stands up like this, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
the one that's in
It
Batman.
has
It was
speakers
very
that
expensive.
go up and down the side. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was like $10,000. Yeah.
Of course, all that was important to Steve Jobs, as we know. He cared about every little aspect of the design. And of course, the early Macs were beige as well. But then there was that break in 1997 where we have the comeback and
Yeah.
the new iMac, which you have right behind you, and two instances of it. And I think the Bondi blue one's down on the lower shelf
Yeah.
behind you.
Yeah.
When that came out, that was the moment where I think the world finally got it that design can matter with your computing, and why not? Like, what if it doesn't increase the price, and it certainly did for that consumer machine, why not have great design too? And from that point on, design has, of course, mattered immensely as the years have gone by.
Yeah. Well, I think that looking back, you had this period of the 70s of very early computers. They were just building these circuit boards and put them in whatever kind of box. And Apple did come along with the Apple II box that was kind of revolutionary at the time.
Right.
And then we went through a period, even when the Mac came out, you had this very beautiful little box kind of all in one. But that was kind of its downside too, was it wasn't expandable. You couldn't do color with it. And I know these are things that Steve Jobs really pushed against actually at the time, which actually led to him leaving Apple in 1985. And it
Right.
really was John Sculley who kind of opened up the Mac. We had the Mac 2, we had
Mhm.
the SE, which did have some expansion to it, had a built-in hard drive and things like that, that really kind of changed the game for the Mac. But then the Mac kind of went through this, like even the Quadras, they were nicely designed beige, kind of semi-white boxes. But then in the rise of Windows 95 and the just sea of off-the-shelf boxes that people were buying at, Sears and Circuit City and whatever,
Right.
computer store that they were buying them from, they were just basic boxes. And I think
Right.
the entire industry just was going through a period where competing on price. Everybody was using Windows. The Mac was failing. It was dying. Steve Jobs, the Apple buys next. Um, Steve Jobs comes back, and there's a huge story with that, which I'm sure we'll be hearing lots about over the next several weeks as we approach Apple's 50th anniversary, or if it's already passed, as you've seen most recently in the news.
Right.
Uh, and it was transformative because, as you said, then Apple really did change the game. And I really think it was because they had to. It was another sort of beautiful gray or beige box. It wouldn't have had the shockwave effect in design that it did. I mean, we saw George Foreman grills, you
Hmm.
name it. Everything had some translucent plastic to it.
Right.
Um, and so I think it really took Apple at the time to say, we're going to make a new computer and we're going to make a statement because we're going to go after the consumer. And I don't know what the real design philosophy or theories were behind, like, hey, let's make this with translucent plastic. Let's do this. I'm sure people smarter than me are more deep into why they did this. But I really think they were going after a consumer, and a
Hmm.
consumer wanted to put a computer, and this was in an era where homes kind of maybe had one computer.
Hmm.
If you're going to have one computer, it's not going to be sitting off in an office. It's going to be something kids use. It's going to be out in the open. And Apple made a very smart move by making something that was attractive and
Hmm.
easy to use and something you wanted to see on display. I mean, I,
Right.
I remember at the time people were like, "Oh, I got this orange one or the lime,"
Hmm.
and it was out on display. It was almost
Right.
like a piece of art, and that really changed the game for Apple and the entire computer industry. You saw a lot of PC manufacturers trying to add this to their beige boxes, but it wasn't the same. There wasn't the reason for it, and
Yeah.
they failed.
Years later, I'm not sure what year you created your site, Apple for Architects. I think by the time you created that site, Architosh had kind of moved on and broad into the whole
Right.
AEC spectrum and window. We cover everything now. What year was it exactly? And you kind of created that site.
Wow. At first I created like a Twitter account just to
Okay.
promote Apple, and Mac and how to use tips, tricks, things like that. Other people would write up. I would want to share it. And so
Hmm.
I created a Twitter site for it initially. And I think that was maybe even back in 2011, 2012.
Hmm.
The site came along much later and was just kind of focused on the same sort of thing. It kind of as a place that the idea was that, to be a site where if you used a Mac in architecture, it'd be a place to actually go and share, find out tips and tricks, things like that. It wasn't ever really a tips and tricks site, really, because I didn't really want to build that.
Right.
Um, but it's really kind of a way for me to share interesting things that I saw online because I have this weird disorder of following Apple and its news
Yeah.
and uh, reading about how-tos and things like that. So I'm not a writer per se, and I
Right.
don't write these things, but I see a lot of things, and it's just a hobby of mine to know how to use these things because I think it really honestly goes back to even the first year I bought my very first Macintosh SE.
Hmm.
Because I had to work two jobs over a summer to save up as much money as I could to try and buy this thing. And it just meant the world to me to be able to have my own Mac at
Hmm.
home that I could use and not have to continue to use this Lisa I was using in this office anymore, and that
Right.
I had lost access to actually at that point
Right.
because I had moved on from working at that for that architect at the time. So I wanted to find as many ways that I could use. I mean, you spend so much money on these things. How can I do as much with it as I can?
Hmm.
And so that was always a driver for me. And I would just follow Mac news and tips and, oh, I can do this. Oh, let me try that. Let me implement that. And so that was kind of really the impetus of it.
Hmm.
And when I started the podcast as well, which has been on, I have to admit, a hiatus for a couple of years for various reasons, but which we can get into a little bit if you want. But
Hmm.
um, you know, the whole impetus behind that was, there are other architects like yourself out there that use Macs,
Hmm.
that love using them and that are architects. And, people need to know about them
Right.
and have a place where we can hear their stories, how they come to use a Mac, what they love about using a Mac, and how they use it in their practice. Because it's not, it's kind of a niche market for Apple.
Hmm.
Apple over the years, especially during the Tim Cook era,
Hmm.
has really expanded beyond anybody's, wildest dreams of
Right.
being a $4 trillion company, or practically at one point they dropped a
Hmm.
little bit, but they're huge, and they went after a global consumer. I
Hmm.
just was reading like 27% of the world's population uses an Apple device.
Yeah.
If they were a country, they would be bigger than India or China. So
Right.
it's just insane the reach that Apple has nowadays. And they have that reach because they went after a basic consumer
Hmm.
and they broadened themselves, especially with the iPhone.
Right.
It broadened out everything that they could do to a larger consumer market. And that's not our market. Architecture, even amongst professionals, is a niche market. And then
Hmm.
what computers we use, again, another niche within a niche.
Right.
And so part of being having the podcast and the site was to, make people aware that they can use a Mac. Because some people, if they think, hey, I worked in this office, it's all been PCs, this is
Hmm.
all I know. Maybe I do use a phone, I use an iPad. Can I use a Mac to practice? And the answer
Right.
is yes. Yes, you can. To go back just a moment, you had mentioned that on Architosh early days, you had a list of firms and such. I have to admit, during that time, I was looking at that site and I was looking for firms that were near me. I
Right.
did that. I was like, can I find a firm that is near to me, not too far, that uses a
Yeah.
Mac because I would want to go work there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't say I found one at the time. But the idea behind the gallery was just kind of fun. You know, I think I threw up on mine the 20th anniversary Mac. I had gotten that and put it on display and thought, this is kind of fun. I want to share it with the community. It's not really my desktop. This wouldn't be a machine, obviously, I could use
Mm-hmm.
for work nowadays
Hmm.
when I put it up. But I thought it'd be kind of a fun idea. Again, going back to the idea of being able to share other architects that work on Apple and Mac computers, or Macs, I should say, and use Apple devices in their day-to-day work. It's like, what do their environments look like? I know what mine looks like. It's a
Hmm.
mess. But what do other people's desks look like? What kind of, I don't know, it just interested me in what type of computers they were using. Did they have an iMac? Was it, a single monitor? Did they have two monitors? Or what are their setups look like? And I
Yeah.
just kind of put it out there to the community. And I don't know, we probably have about a dozen or so examples on the site that
Hmm.
I haven't been pushing for. I've kind of taken a step back from social media the last several years for various
Hmm.
reasons. And kind of haven't been advocating for people to send in images. Maybe I'll get some more now and I'll have to dive back in and add some more. But I
Yeah.
thought it was just kind of fun to see what other people's work environment and how they use their Macs. Mac users in general, we're really proud of our machines. It's a weird thing. If you ask your general computing using person, they're like, "What computer do you use?" I don't know. No, it's this thing that whatever work gave me. I just sit down, I look at a screen. But I think for Apple users and Mac users in general,
Hmm.
we're really proud. We're very excited about, oh, I use a Mac Mini, or I use this, or I, have a Mac Pro, and what type, and, what are the config. Mac people are kind of nerds like that. And
Yeah.
architects are their own special types of nerds. And when we all get together, it's a lot of fun because
Right.
it's just weird. We enjoy sharing that kind of information. And I thought the site could be an avenue for that to happen. And I've had,
Yeah.
so. that's kind of where it started. I've had to step back from it just because of work related. I've just gotten really super busy with work and I've had to focus on that. And family wise, I've had kids finishing high school and moving off to college, which I've chosen to focus on more so than trying to be the online person and doing that. So that's it's still out there. And I would love to get back to it and kind of play around with that and do some more shows, but
Yeah,
just hasn't happened yet.
it'll, I'm sure the time will come and it'll be great to see you get back into that. You know, so you mentioned an interesting thing, which is how we're kind of nerds about our machines a little bit more than the average person. And I've been, you've probably seen the site Masterclass. I'm sure you might have
Hmm.
taken one. Cal Newport wrote this book called Deep Work, which I've had for a long time. And he teaches a masterclass. And I decided to take his class because I like him immensely. He's all about focus and
Hmm.
practical strategies for increasing focus and so forth. And one of the things he said in his class touches on this aspect of how Apple users are more passionate about their machines. And what he said was very interesting. It had to do with craft.
Mm.
And his strategy was essentially one of his strategies is to pick tools, regardless of what you do in life, pick tools that help you with your work, that will help you elevate your craft of what you do. If you're a screenwriter, if you are a painter, or if you're a dentist, whatever it is, if you focus on craft of what if you know that's it's his
Hmm.
word for just being the absolute best, doing the best kind of work you could possibly do in your field. And if you think about it being a crafts person, like a Renaissance master, um,
Sure.
then he has found that if you pick tools that echo that aspect of craft, like the tools themselves have this level of craft in them, they will constantly remind you, maybe subliminally, maybe subtly, on a daily basis of that you need to be focusing on craft with what you do. And
Oh,
so I've
fascinating.
always thought that personally for me, the reason why I wanted to work on the Mac is because it echoed an ethos about design and quality, which I
Yeah.
obviously want to put into my practice as an architect. But this connection to craft that he spoke about was interesting because he was connecting craft to the psychology of helping you remember why you're doing what you're doing and remembering to focus on being the absolute best at it. And
Yeah.
I thought that was another layer to the kind of layers I've always had in thinking about why do architects want to work on the Mac? Why do some of us at least care so much about working on the Mac? So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's, I think there's something there to that. I know for me personally, I get a lot of pleasure out of sitting down and the fact that the screen I'm staring into happens to be an Apple Studio display. And why is it not an LG Superfine? Because I really love looking at this thing. Even
Hmm.
though I'm staring, the panels are the same, but the experience of using it is so much nicer. It's not a cheap plastic thing that kind of tilts funny. I mean, when I go into my office, um, we have two very nice 4K monitors, but they're just Dells and they're plastic. They kind of tilt a little to the right, a little to the left, and I'm always kind of like tilting them around and getting them just right. And then I come home and I'm on this Apple Studio display, which is just gorgeously gorgeous and super expensive. I understand, but when I have to tilt it or I have the height adjustable one, yes, because I'm foolish with my money. Um, but if I have to move it up and down, it's just a finger. It just goes up and down. I can press it on the far right. It just glides up and it, the care that Apple takes in making its products just brings a joy to having to sit here sometimes all day and, grinding through, work.
Right.
It just gives me that pleasure, which is nice and I enjoy it. So I think that Masterclass was I think he was onto something there, at least for those of us that use the Mac.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how do you think about Apple today and as we approach the 50th anniversary in a few days?
Yeah.
How would you summarize where they have been and where you would like to see them go? Obviously, I bet you'd like to see them be more present in the field of architecture, of course, me too. That probably isn't going to be their focus. It's such a sub-market of sub-market.
Yeah.
But as a major force in the life of so many people on our planet, you
Yeah.
know, where would you like to see, what do you think about where they should go? And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, I do think it's interesting that while they're not going to put, as part of the 50th anniversary, they've been having musical events,
Hmm.
several around the world, starting in New York, and they've had two, I think, in China, and more on the way
Right.
as we approach April 1st, which is their 50th anniversary of their founding. And I find it ironic, though, that while Apple doesn't focus, and we've touched on it a couple times, so much on architecture or architects in general, and yet when you look at their stores, they're amazing pieces of architecture. So
Mhm.
while architects are not getting up on stage to perform or do something to celebrate Apple's 50th, if you look at all of the buildings that Apple is celebrating their 50th anniversary in, they're amazing pieces of architecture. Grand Central Station, in New York, if you've ever been
Right.
there, it's
Yeah.
incredible. It's an incredible space. I
Yeah.
don't know what the acoustics were for the concert, but I know I've been there. It's an incredible space. Some of the other buildings, I was in Chicago last summer briefly and going to see the store there. Unfortunately, by the time I got there, it had closed, so I didn't get inside of it. But it's an outdoor space and you can walk around. It's just incredible.
Yes.
Their own headquarters, Apple Park, an
Hmm.
amazing piece of architecture. So while Apple doesn't celebrate architects in the same way that they do, artists of music or other, photography or videography, architecture is very present in almost everything Apple does in the way it presents itself to the public with its stores mostly, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about all of the devices, they're beautiful pieces of art, but also architecture because they're something that somebody has built. So that's
Hmm.
the way I vision it. Um, where does Apple go from here? I mean, they've had an incredible history.
Hmm.
Um, what I hope for Apple is that it continues to focus on, basically what they started to do. It's a computer for the rest of us.
Hmm.
I think the iPhone today is probably the ultimate personification of that statement. It is the computer for the rest of us. It has been the most popular device practically in the world that anybody's ever created. And I want them to keep focusing on that. How
Hmm.
does how do they keep making computers for the rest of us? And around that time, this would have been 2004 for myself. Um, the firm I was working for at the time wasn't I don't know, wasn't super busy, and I didn't I was married but didn't have kids yet.
Hmm.
And on a chance, I applied to work for Apple
Right.
Retail. I had
Right.
heard about them opening up their first San Francisco flagship store,
Hmm.
and I applied. And ironically enough, I got through the initial interview. I did a phone interview, that they do, and then I got past that. And I'm a practicing artist. I've been licensed almost a decade by now, by this point. And uh, I went down to Cupertino and met with the managing staff for the
Hmm.
store as another, like my third interview or something.
Right.
And they ended up hiring me. And I was on the very first crew that was there that day that the flat San Francisco, the original store on Market Street
Oh,
opened
wow.
up. And that was like in, I think, February of 2004 or something.
Right.
And I went through because I was here in the Bay Area. Now, I
Mm,
know a lot of store employees don't get a chance to do this, but it was so early days of the Apple Store that I was able to go to one of their offices over on Bub Street.
mhm,
And this is one of their original offices. And they had a mock-up of an original store of a store inside this warehouse.
mhm,
We were not allowed to go in it, by the way. It was all roped off,
mhm,
but we could see in it. And we did all our training for like 2 weeks. Every
mhm.
weekend for 8 hours for Saturday and Sunday, we did our training for 2 or 3 weeks in a row. And then we had the grand opening. And at that grand opening, every single senior Apple executive, Jobs himself, were there. And
Wow.
so we didn't really get to meet or chat too much with some of them, but I was
Mhm,
at the top of the glass staircase that day. And at the time, Gavin Newsom, who is now the governor of California, but at the time was the mayor of San Francisco, he was standing next to me. Willie Brown, the former mayor, was standing next to me all at the top of the stairs. It was
mhm,
just an incredible event. I should have probably said that was one of my one of my favorite Apple history memories
mhm,
is being there for that day of the opening of the Apple Store. But ironically enough, I just wanted to throw this part in, is
mhm.
that one of the reasons I got the job was because I was an architect. At the
Wow.
time, Apple, and they told me this directly during my last interview. And
Mm,
the reason they were doing that is because they were trying to hire professional people that had
mhm,
different skills. I mean, a
mhm.
lot of my coworkers were professional photographers, videographers, musicians, just incredible people. These were not just like casual people wanting to have a retail job.
Yeah.
A lot of these people, have gone on to do amazing things, actually,
Yeah.
but I was like the architect expert. And so I would get emails from my coworkers, hey, somebody came in, was asking about this. How do they do this on a Mac? Or,
Right.
what's the best architecture drafting program? And so I got consulted all the time for
Mhm.
that. And that's one of the things they wanted to hire an architect to have working in the store. You
So
know, I
go
was going
ahead.
to say, one of my favorite memories, I've got a couple from the past 50 years for myself. And one actually I hadn't written down, but just comes to me is when the Newton first came out.
Mhm,
It was like 19, I don't know, 93, no, maybe 94. And they had an event at Apple's Infinite Loop
right.
campus, which was actually brand new at the time, or very, very new. And
Mhm,
I was able to actually go onto the campus, internal to the buildings, and they had like a displays, and they had Newtons there. You could try them. We didn't have digital cameras then. I'd have no photos of attending that event, but
mhm,
just to be on the campus was really amazing, fun to do, and just an experience of using this new product at the time, the Newton,
mhm.
which ironically enough is at the heart of everything Apple does today. Not
Right.
from necessarily a software side, but the chips that they co-created or helped fund, the
Right.
ARM-based chips that basically all of our Macs, our iPhones, our iPads use that chip architecture. And that was created because of the Newton. Apple, when they first introduced the iPhone, they needed a chip that would be very power efficient and fast. The ARM-based processors, and then eventually they had their own. The A4 first came out, it's their own chip. And they
Mhm,
invested and they did that. And then I think what you saw is that got better. They got better at designing their own chips, and they saw from Apple's perspective, what can we do when we make our own silicon? Look what we can do with these phones. Look what we can do with these iPads. And I think actually there was a period in the 20 teens where
mhm.
Apple thought, and I mean, they even had an ad, an iPad is a computer, right?
Right.
And I think there was a brief time during the mid-teens that Apple thought the iPad and the iPhone were going to be the future.
Mhm,
Macs really stagnated. for
Right.
several years during those teen times. I think that Johnny Ive also, from a design perspective, he was given so much control after Steve Jobs passed that, in order to keep I think there's several things here. In order for Tim Cook to keep everyone thinking that Apple was going to survive, it wasn't going to die, crash and burn again, just like it did after the first time Steve Jobs left,
Hmm.
is that, oh, we're going to elevate Johnny Ive. See, we still have all these people here and they're going to do this. And I think Johnny Ive, without Steve Jobs as a counterbalance, went
Hmm.
too far. I mean, we
Right.
saw things like the butterfly keyboard. We saw laptops losing ports, getting down to, I mean, famously, they had the MacBook, the 12-inch MacBook came out around, I think, 2015. It had one port. You charge it, you do everything, one port. And it was like the personification of everything that Johnny Ivewell, a brilliant designer, and we
Hmm.
can thank him for doing all of these things for all these years for Apple and all the devices that we used. But I think without that counterbalance of Steve Jobs, he pushed it too far.
Hmm.
And with that combined with Apple realizing what they can do when they design their own silicone, both of those things kind of occurred during the mid 2000 teens, and they were wrong. The iPad wasn't the future, wasn't the
Right.
computer. It's an incredible device. We all use them and love them for what they do. But when it comes to certain things, the Mac is better.
Hmm.
And I think Apple finally realized that. And not only did they realize that, but they also realized we're building these chips. We can make them for our Macs as well.
Right.
And Intel was struggling so much during the 20 teens. I mean, one of the problems, not only with that 5 to 12-inch MacBook, was it is incredibly slow
Hmm.
because the Intel chips were just so hot. They couldn't
Hmm.
put anything faster. It was similar to we never saw a 3 gigahertz, or no, we never saw the 3 gigahertz G5,
Hmm.
and we never saw a G5 excuse me, in a laptop.
Right.
So it was the same problem that Steve Jobs encountered in the early 2000s that I
Right.
think Apple was experiencing in the mid 20 teens. And
Hmm.
then they realized we can make these chips for Apple, for the Mac.
Hmm.
And I think it was a long-term process of deprecating older APIs and
Hmm.
laying the foundation, the groundwork, so that in 2010 or 2020, Apple could bring out their own Apple Silicon. And I think after these last 5+ years of Apple Silicon, they can finally take these chips and put them into devices that literally would have been impossible for them to create just 10 years ago.
One of the fundamental things that is so interesting about this development with Apple Silicon is that from the beginning, from the M1 on, they have jumped way ahead of the competition in single core processing. And single core processing is the processing of what we do in architecture because
A lot of
the
it,
way
yes.
what CAD works and BIM works when you are manipulating models or even 2D drawings, things need to work one after another. You can't jump ahead and start computing something when an architect's spinning a model around or doing something. The computer doesn't know what's going to happen in the mind of the architect, the user. So we are stuck in the serial processing for the most part for so much of what we do in our work in tools like Revit or SketchUp or Rhino. Yet, Apple doesn't have some of these tools on their platform.
Yeah.
That is really unfortunate. It means that the profession, a large part of it, maybe even the majority in the United States market, doesn't really get to enjoy the power of these new M-based Macintoshes, and which is kind of sad.
Yeah, it really is. I've given some thought about this one too, is that I think for Apple to experience this, to have the ability to enjoy a larger market within our world of architecture is really going to take a new app,
Mhm.
something new that changes the game. we're starting to see that slowly with more and more kind of applications being built for the web,
Hmm.
which at least allows the Macintosh to play in that world.
Right.
There's I know there's different apps that are being created for the web, uh, and they go through a web app. I'm not a fan. I don't like to do that. I like a native app. I really want a native app. I guess I'm just an older school Apple user. I want an app,
Right.
and I enjoy that experience. I use Trello, for instance, for some of my tracking for CA projects. And I downloaded the Trello app instead of having it up in a web browser. I have a
Right.
coworker, she just uses it through a web browser, and that's
Right.
just what she's used to. But I do think that it's going to take for Apple to really kind of have inroads into architecture. We need to see something new happen because we had initially things like AutoCAD, and AutoCAD was on the Mac, and then it disappeared for two
Hmm.
decades or so, and
Hmm.
eventually it came back. But by the time it came back, it was not as important because the world of architecture had moved on to Revit,
Right.
at least in the larger corporate world of architecture. And I don't even mean there's lots of smaller firms. Everybody uses Revit.
Hmm.
And there's plenty of architecture firms out there, and there's plenty of smaller firms that use ArchiCAD or they use Vectorworks. And these are all fantastic alternatives.
Hmm.
But every job application, that you see out there, it's like must have Revit experience or something. It used
Hmm.
to be must have AutoCAD experience. And all these firms are just set up with massive amounts of PCs, and they're all Windows based. Accounting is Windows, so our architecture stuff has to all be on Windows. It's
Hmm.
that kind of thinking
Hmm.
that has permeated architecture firms of most sizes. There are some larger firms that work on Macs, but for the most part, they're all Windows. So
Hmm.
what's really going to change that is Apple has to have a product that is price competitive. Now, the Neo is price competitive. It's in a whole new world of price that Apple's never played in as far as a laptop is concerned. But
Hmm.
really, they need their desktops or other laptops, like you mentioned, the M5s.
Hmm.
You can get an M5 MacBook Pro. It's probably very competitive to an equivalent sort of PC-based laptop
Hmm.
that you could buy. And so, because there's not a lot of, I shouldn't make a generality, but what I do see sometimes, and I know a previous job I had, it was like we had to go buy a gaming PC
Hmm.
because that was what we had to have for the graphics card to run something like Revit in.
Right.
And so there weren't like business architecture kind of focused that PCs out there that weren't just for gaming, for instance. So I think
Yeah.
Apple's got the power to run these types of apps, but we need something to come along and knock Revit off its perch. And maybe that'll happen, maybe not. You know, I don't know, but that's what I see for Apple to really make big inroads into architecture
Hmm.
is that Revit PC sort of marriage needs to be broken somehow. And I don't
Right.
know if it'll ever happen because maybe the next thing will also run on a PC, just like AutoCAD did, and
Hmm.
that'll never change.
Hmm.
But I think that is something that needs to happen. And something else, to be honest with you, it's a program we don't think about when we think about architecture as much,
Hmm.
but one that's super critical for me, and especially the last few years that I've been doing a lot of construction and administration work on, is Bluebeam.
Hmm.
Now, Bluebeam had a Mac version, and they killed it 5, 6 years ago. I don't understand that. I know it's a development costs and everything, but Bluebeam is such a critical app, especially here in California. If you work on any kind of, and I have over the last 18 months, been
Hmm.
doing schoolwork, K through 12.
Right.
And our Department of DSA, as we call it here, we submit our plans through Bluebeam Studio. They
Right.
review them in Bluebeam Studio. We literally do our plan check comments in Bluebeam Studio.
Hmm.
Um, Apple needs to talk to get Bluebeam native on the Mac. I know they keep playing around with a
Hmm.
web version. No, we need a native Bluebeam app.
Hmm.
It's critical. as I mentioned, in order for Apple to really make inroads with that, they've got to do a couple of things, which
Hmm.
is continue to innovate and create those computers for the rest of us and more powerful machines, create a better option. And then if that better option is there, the developers will rush to that and develop tools that we can use for those devices. I mean, we've seen it with the iPhone.
Hmm.
We're seeing it with the M1 Max and the ARM Max. And it's having an effect on the Windows world as well. You know, as more and more developers are trying to develop Windows for ARM and apps for that, because the computers are better than the
Hmm.
old Wintel,
Hmm.
the Intel devices.
Right.
So, and Intel's struggling with that.
Hmm.
So, and they're getting better. You know, everybody, it's not always going to be true, these things. And
Hmm.
so that's what I think Apple, you had asked me, what do they need to keep doing? They need to keep acting like tomorrow they're going out of business. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Apple's got a bright future ahead and there'll be another chapter and it'll be a fun ride as it's been for the last 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Neil, thank you for coming on, and I really enjoyed this conversation. You shared a lot of interesting insights about your kind of past and Apple and architecture. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Thanks.